Let's just take a moment to breathe together. I want to thank everyone who participated in this procession by being present, by carrying a candle, by sending in a picture, by witnessing, and in your own private reflections. Thank you. When my uncle died, my father informed us in the same breath that he told us that my Uncle Fred had died, that we would not be going to the services. We were never close to him, he explained. And it seemed a little odd to me. I was just a kid. But this man was someone he had known since he had been just a kid. For my aunt had married him when my father was still in grade school. And it was his home, his and my aunt's, that we visited every summer. It was the place that we thought of as our home base. They were the grandparents we didn't have on that side because of everything that had happened. But in fact, we did not go to the service, and my uncle's name was never mentioned by my father again. Now, each of my parents had lost one of their parents to an unusual form of early death. And my sense now, with the perspective that I have, is that in both of the climates of their growing up, there was just no energy to help them understand what death is, what it means, and how to face it. They were left as children without anyone to teach them about how we live with death and the reality of death, and so they did not have anything to pass down to us. One of my greatest gifts from being part of a faith community is that I get to learn a lot about grief and grieving and get those lessons that I wasn't taught as a child. Researcher Mary Beth O'Connor says that grief is, in fact, a form of learning. And by grieving, we allow ourselves the space to learn that the world around us has changed in some very fundamental way, and that takes time to recognize. Through this learning, we forge new daily routines that must happen because without the ones who have been part of the fabric of our life, life is, in fact, very different. Now, I will be honest. When you are a minister in California, you do a lot more celebrations of life than you do weddings, because in California, people can get a license to allow their dog to marry them, and anyone else for that matter. However, previous to coming to California, I did a lot of weddings. And "till death do us part" was something that was often said in those ceremonies. Yet the reality is that death parts us, and it also doesn't part us from those we love. Death parts us in some irreversible and often agonizing ways from the physical and real-time engagement with the one we love, for we can no longer feel their presence, we can't feel the pressure of their hand, we can't hear their voice through our ears. Well, some of us still can talk, but not through the ears. O'Connor says that grief is learned, and grief is also a process of yearning. The place of yearning and grieving is that longing to hear and feel and be together in those known and familiar ways. This is the parting we do experience. We yearn for this to be different and to return to another time, and though they are gone from our sight, we long to be with them. Yet, in another way, those that we've loved and lost remain with us in very active manners. We may not be able to hear their voice with our ears, but we talk to them with our hearts. We may not be able to take an actual stroll with them, yet it often feels as if they're traveling right with us, experiencing what we experience. This is a part of grieving too, as we figure out how to work with this new reality. Without a learning and a curiosity about grief, the pain in this part of the relationship may seem too overwhelming, and we may cut ourselves off from any further relationship or even deny the significance of the relationship, as my father did. The wisdom traditions of the world are designed to teach us about how to interact with our grief, how to keep learning, how to be on that journey, and how to acknowledge that we have a continued relationship with the people that we've lost. Rituals and practices that some might see as superstitious or pointless or even morbid have a real purpose. O'Connor describes how when people have a deep relationship, especially when they are mates, the brain chemistry actually changes in both people. And when grieving happens, the brain chemistry changes again. And so while the loss is there, people are not really disconnected completely in spirit or emotion simply through the physical act of death. This service, which I truly believe is one of the most important we do each year, is part of countering that dominant culture that says that grief is something we should get over as soon as possible. And it also honors a very particular part of our heritage, which is the universalist belief that all souls will eventually be redeemed. Now, this idea to us today may seem completely antiquated because who really cares if souls have redemption after death? But if we think of it in a more practical term, it means that our relationships with those who have departed also have the possibility of redemption, even those relationships that weren't resolved at the time of the physical death. The Dia de los Muertos observances, which Michael illuminated for us, are one of the ramps to this kind of understanding, this kind of intergenerational cultural learning. And also, there are so many other traditions. The Ojibwe, when they lose somebody, will hold a 24-hour ancestor fire on the loved one's first birthday to honor their memory after the death. It helps family members, especially children, understand that they're part of a long succession of ancestors leading back to the beginning of time. They also have a death feast, which always accompanies this effort. In the Jewish tradition, there's sitting Shiva, the name for the 7-day mourning period where friends and family visit one another and sit and talk and eat and celebrate the life that has ended. Those mourning rituals stretch over a year, which recognizes the length of a grieving process, a relearning time, if you will. It is important for us to remember that it takes some time to grieve, that grief has a cycle and a rhythm, though most understand now that there's no set course on the journey of relearning. What is important is that we take the time to accept the integration and healing, to know what it is that our relationship is now with those who have died. And when we do this, when we make intentional spaces like those we create each month in our grief groups here, then we have, O'Connor says, more chance of moving through this process as a learning process and less as one that may form threats to our mental health. For example, O'Connor says, grief is not depression, and people often confuse the two, she finds in her research. Grief is about a very particular change in our circumstance that we need to emotionally recognize, a very particular loss, while depression is about larger forces. Someone can be depressed and grieving, but they don't have to be companions. As the world moves away from religious practices, we also move away from what they teach us. The rituals around grief are an example. Doing these rituals, these time-honored practices, allow us to acknowledge our continued relationship with our grief. By becoming learners at the School of Grief, we enter an important credential for these times. It is important that we have places where we can talk about our loss and places where we acknowledge our ongoing relationships. So let us sit right now together with one more breath, with our grief together, for in these times of so much loss and death, almost everyone here has someone for whom their grief is fresh. Let us be present to the wisdom of our bodies, our minds, and spirit, Let us be like that cloud in the sky that Thich Nhat Hanh spoke of. Let us remember that we can always lift our eyes and our hearts to the skies. Let our spirits be renewed in our learning, travelers along this path of grief, and in doing so, we will find new strengths, new abilities, and new wisdom.